They say a man who represents himself has a fool for a client. Well, with God as my witness, I am that fool.
What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, Mtg, trolling everybody with this hair, and today we got a deck that provides a more irritating experience for your opponent than 1994's A Troll in Central Park. That's right, I'm coming for it. You suck, Don Bluth. Never made a good movie. I guess Anastasia's fine, but I will never forgive you for Thumbelina, just like your opponent will never forgive you for playing this deck. Why did I yell about Don Bluth for 15 seconds? Nobody came for that. What you came for was to see if we made Waking the Trolls work. And we did, but not before we had to try a whole bunch of different stuff. So let's talk about that for a second, if you don't mind, because I've been all around the world and under every bridge with this stinking card for the last 2 weeks, and I want to turn that into content. So I think it's important to you to hear me talk about what I tried before I landed on the actual list here. A lot of ways I tried to take advantage of this card. First of all, started with the Confounding Conundrum Cleansing Wildfire combo. I hesitate to call it that because it doesn't really work and it's a little bit too cute. I also tried Confounding Conundrum and Field of Ruin, which technically works as well if you're just really trying to troll your opponent as much as possible. But this is a 3-color deck, so we cut Field of Ruin real quick, and Cleansing Wildfire was just way too cute. As a matter of fact, I ended up finding Conundrum a little bit too cute altogether. It wasn't the main deck, got cut to the sideboard. Turns out we beat the ramp decks anyway. That's kind of what we prey on, so we just didn't need it there. And ultimately, it didn't end up in the 75, period, even though it looks like the kind of card that should go in this deck. So then I moved on to a Jund build that I was really excited about because, like, come on. It's Jund, right? We all get unreasonably excited from Jund to time, or any red-blooded Magic player does at least. But I was excited about this because we get to play Valky, Tybalt, whatever, good early drop, great late drop that we should be able to get to. We're ostensibly a ramp deck, or at least Waking wants us to be. So we also get Binding the Old Gods in the Jund color combination, removal piece that also ramps us into stuff. We need that. So I was really, really pumped for this deck. It's bad. I don't know why. I just couldn't get this deck to work, even though it's full of atrociously good cards. So I'm still a little bit raw about that, to be honest. So then I moved back to test out the tried and true Teamer again because I felt like this was the right color combination for the deck, mostly because I missed Sideboard Negates. There was another card I missed a whole lot, and we'll get to it in a second, but I want to talk about the actual card Waking the Trolls for just a moment. What are we, 20 minutes into the video at this point? Anyway, everyone was excited about this card. I can't have been the only one when this card first got spoiled to get really irrationally up that this card exists in the first place, right? 6 mana is an awful lot to get this thing on the board, but right now there are a ton of decks that are trying to get to Genesis Ultimatum, Emergent Ultimatum, the Sultai one, as well as Ugin the Spirit Dragon, and a whole bunch of other cards that cost a bunch of mana. Mana's at a premium more than ever in Standard right now because decks are trying to do really silly things in the late game. So blowing up lands even for 6 mana is actually not the worst deal in the world. Plus you get the land back. Whatever you blew up, you're probably going to get back this on the second chapter of Waking the Trolls, and sometimes that can be a fabled passage. Pretty sweet. Although if your opponent's playing Croxer or trying to escape a thing, maybe you don't want to put that fabled passage right back in their graveyard just now. Consider that. Came up a few times, but most of the time you're going to get a passage back and pop it immediately. But there's other times where you get really nice stuff, like a Crawling Barrens. You know, this deck is one of the only decks that has a real answer to Crawling Barrens, and not only does it have the answer, you just get the Crawling Barrens. Same thing with Faceless Haven. I didn't want to make all the mana in this deck snow to like take advantage of Faceless Haven because I think that would be very bad, actually. I think that would be very, very bad. But maybe you can go about trying that out if you want to. But even if we just take our opponent's Faceless Haven away from them, that's still an answer to Faceless Haven, which is really important in today's meta. But of course, the mode everyone's here for is the last mode where you get a bunch of trolls. So you get a whole bunch of 4/4 trolls. And that's a solid mode, y'all. And there's a few things I considered doing in this deck to pump this mode up a little bit. Like Doomscar Titan, for instance, was on the table for a while. And that does lead to some pretty hilarious things happening, but in the end I cut that card. It just turns out that if you've blown up a land, gotten one of theirs, and then gotten like 4 or 5 trolls out of the deal, there's often not much your opponent can do about that, so you don't need an extra card to win the game. But of course, this can't be the only card to blow up lands if we're going to call this a land destruction deck. There needs to be at least one more in modern day Standard Magic. So we're going to play 4 copies of Smashing Success, instant speed, Land destruction. Never thought I'd see this, especially at a cost of quote-unquote only 4 mana. They just will not reprint Stone Rain. They won't give us 3 mana land destruction, even though it was like a pretty common thing for a long time. But they won't give it to us anymore, so instead, they try to make 4 mana land destruction as palatable as possible. And in this case, we get a Demolish. It hits artifacts and lands. That can also be cast at instant speed. Just strictly better Demolish, and I'll take that any day of the week. You know, set a stop if you're playing on Arena, or in real life, you can just say, hey, before you draw your card for the turn. Remember when we used to do that? We used to talk to each other. But in any case, you can blow up one of your opponent's lands right before their draw step with this card, and sometimes that is really super important to remember, so take advantage of the instant speed on this whenever you can. Now, of course, to take as much advantage of the third chapter of Waking the Trolls as possible, we got to play a fair number of ramp spells in the deck. I'm on 9 altogether, and honestly, I still want to cut one of them, but what we're running at the moment, at least, is 4 copies of Cultivate. You probably expected that, as well as 4 copies of Beanstalk Giant, and 1 copy of Migration Path. This was 2 copies to begin with. I've cut it down to 1, and I'm thinking about cutting it from the deck entirely, but there are plenty of times where you cultivate into Migration Path, into Waking, and you will eventually get all of the trolls in the world. So do keep that in mind. As far as Beanstalk Giant, oh, and as far as Migration Path goes, if you don't want it, you can throw it away and draw cards. So might as well have the 1 copy. But Beans is in here, and Beans is good for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Not only is this ramp, you definitely desire that, but it's also something to ramp into, and it's really, really good right now. There's a lot of stuff that really just can't handle a Beanstalk Giant on the table. So this card has actually won me a whole bunch of games, and it's nice to have a big meaty threat that can take advantage of, you know, an empty board state or a bad board state for your opponent, when we really don't have a whole lot of threats in this deck, to be honest with you. But aside from that, Cultivate is just the best ramp spell in the entire format, so we'll play all 4 copies of that. Pretty much no questions asked. Do you have any questions about 4 copies of Cultivate? I don't think you do. But since we're playing all that ramp, we probably need something to ramp into besides just Waking the Trolls, right? I mean, we're going to have a bunch of mana. We should probably use it on something other than Beanstalk Giants. So I'm playing 4 copies of Genesis Ultimatum. I bet you saw this coming. I mean, while we're talking about trolling people, right, why not play one of the trolliest cards in all of Standard? It sucks to get hit by a Genesis Ultimatum, and when we play it in this deck, we got a lot of high-profile targets to hit. First of all, awesome to hit a Waking the Trolls with a Genesis Ultimatum, right? 9 times out of 10, that's fairly game-winning, but we've also got the ability to hit Beanstalk Giant and a bunch of other creatures and such that I haven't shown you yet, but shortly will. This is the other reason I decided to go back to playing blue in the deck, because Genesis Ultimatum it's too strong. It's far too strong. But like I said, there's creatures in this deck. Hard to believe, because we're already a good ways through this thing. Haven't really shown you too many creatures besides Beans yet, but we are playing some adventure dudes besides Beans himself. We're playing 4 copies of Brazen Borrower and 4 copies of Bones. Hey, Ziggy showed up. Now, Bray Wyatt over here, Brazen Borrower, is actually really good in this format right now. I know there's stuff like Yorion and other things that kind of suck to give your opponent another ETB trigger on, but at the same time, there's a fair number of tokens and whatnot in this format, and there's a fair number of times where this sort of tempo or bounce effect can be really advantageous. For instance, we suck, kind of, against that mono-white aggro deck that likes to stick a Seasoned Hallowblade and then put like a Maul of the Skyclaves on it or protect it with like Selfless Savior. You know the deck I'm talking about. Now, a little bit of bounce during their combat step works wonders against that deck for setting them back in terms of pace, and that can sometimes be all the opening that we need. So just in that one situation, Borrower is indispensable, but there's plenty of other situations Borrower is a good card. And as far as Bone Crusher over here, this is some of the only real early game removal that we have access to in the main deck at the very least. We really beef up the removal in the sideboard, but in the main deck, we really put a lot of pressure on Bones to guide our early game and make sure that he keeps small creatures off the table. You know, keep these aggro decks from breathing down our necks. So really important roles these things fill, but they're also creatures that can be hit with the Genesis Ultimatum or just be extra threats to finish the game. That gets pretty important too. But we're not quite done with creatures, because I'm splitting the 5-drop slot between the 2 copies of Goldspan Dragon and the 2 copies of Terror of the Peaks. Now, both of these do really cool stuff for this deck, so I just couldn't decide which one I wanted a 4 of, basically. Terror of the Peaks is really ridiculous with Waking the Trolls, because when Waking the Trolls goes off, you get all your trolls, you just win if you have a Terror of the Peaks out, so that's a good thing. to be able to do, and it's really super satisfying too. So I kept Terror in the deck, but I also kept Goldie in the deck. This is the same 2-2 split I've basically been working with since the beginning of building this deck, because I just can't decide if I like peanut butter or chocolate more. I can't make that decision, so instead, we'll just make it a 2-2 split, because Goldspan is a haste attacker that's really good at finishing the game quickly. Both of these come down right after a Cultivate, or at least in turn sequence after a Cultivate. It's important to have these 5 drops. Goldspan Dragon also helps us ramp into, say, a Genesis Ultimatum on the next turn, or if they kill Goldspan Dragon with a removal spell or after it attacks or something. With a sweeper, we still have that treasure token, so if we don't have another land, that'll help us ramp from 5 into 6 mana for, say, Awaking the Trolls. So there's a lot of stuff that Goldspan does in this deck, but nothing beats Terror of the Peaks into 3rd chapter of Waking the Trolls. I had to keep that dream alive. And finally, a couple of copies of Shatter Skull Smashing, because why not? You know, we need removal in this deck. When we don't go up against creatures decks, this is just a land. When we do, we get to blow stuff up because we're a ramp deck. We should have no shortage of mana to kill stuff with a Shatter Skull Smashing. So I just don't think there's a reason to not play some number of this card. And here's our mana base. Together with Smashing, we have a total of 27 lands, and there have been a couple of times where I felt like beefing that up. But since we have Cultivate, Beanstalk Giant, it's not too hard to get to that 3rd land, and then start exploding with lands because of all the ramp in our deck and such. So that's a good thing. We don't know that we need a 28th land in this deck is what I'm saying. But as far as how things shake out here, the mana's been pretty good, although there have been plenty of times I want a 4th copy of Crag Crown Pathway. But that said, we do need a large number of basic lands in this deck because we're going to be using our opponent's Fabled Passage. We're going to be using Cultivate, Beanstalk Giant, and even the occasional Migration Path. So we need tons and tons of basic lands in this deck. Now here's the sideboard, which is probably the thing that has changed the least since I started putting this deck together. It's honestly pretty cut and dry. There's those negates I was talking about. Those are extremely important. Against Yorion decks, I want to play Emergent Ultimatum and all kinds of other stuff right now. Negate is just a very important tool to have access to. And then we get into the removal. 2 Scorching Dragonfire to help cover our butts in the early game, as well as 3 Crush the Weak to deal with small ball aggro decks, like the Clarion Spirit deck, for instance. And then we've got a couple of copies of Storm's Wrath in there to kind of round out the sweeper package, the removal package against these aggro decks, because we don't have a whole lot of protection in the early game. And sometimes decks will just get down 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop and beat us that way. We're much better against decks that take some time to develop their plan and need some lands to do so. So sometimes we'll be dead before we can cast, you know, a smashing success, much less Waking the Trolls. And that's where we bring in all these sweepers and other removal pieces to help cinch up those games. But we've also got 2 copies of Soul Seer, probably the weirdest looking card in the sideboard. This is specifically for Seasoned Hallowed Blades. Remember, I said we're bad against that card. This is what that's for. Sometimes they'll still have an All-Seed of Life spouting, and then your life is terrible. But still, Soul Seer, it can be a way to kill that Seasoned Hallowed Blade. That's what it's for. Then we got 2 copies of Ugin the Spirit Dragon against decks Ugin is good against, right? Because we make all the mana in the world. If the game's going to go long anyway, why not play a couple of copies of Ugin? That's a thing we can do. Now here are your power rankings, and then I'm going to show you 3 quick games. That's how we're doing gameplay this time. There is gameplay in this video, I promise. But I do want to talk about the power rankings for just a second before we get to those. A final score of 67, which ties for best score of the season. We just can't get over that 67 hump, can we? We will soon, but that means this deck is pretty good, although I wouldn't necessarily call it like a tiered deck or anything, right? I think that Temur Adventures is probably altogether the better deck than this, but this deck is about 1,000 times more fun than Temur Adventures. So you got that going for you. And it's still a really solid deck too, with some actual game right now. Again, against all these Yorion decks that are extremely popular in best of 3, that's easily our best matchup. Anyone that's trying to play Emergent Ultimatum against us is probably going to get embarrassed. Same thing with anyone trying to play Ugin or, you know, Genesis Ultimatum for that matter. Even if we're on the draw, it's fairly easy for us to deprive them of the mana needed to cast these spells. Even if they can get to 7 or 8 lands, we can often pinpoint the lands they need the most to cast the ultimatums they're trying to cast. And at that point, we more or less just win those games. So we actually have really good game against some of the literal best decks in the format. It's where those aggro decks come in that we have a problem. So we're a little 50-50 here. But again, after sideboarding, we have much better games in those bad matchups. But anyway, let's look at some quick games here that illustrates some of my points. in some ways, right? Like this first game is against a Teamer Ultimatum deck, and we basically keep them from casting Genesis Ultimatum, and that is what ends up winning us this game. In this next game, we're up against a mono-black Ugin deck or just a mono-black control deck, but either way, they're trying to cast something, whether it's Peer into the Abyss or Ugin or something like that, and we end up killing their Crawling Barons, like I was talking about earlier, as well as their Castle Locthwain. They eventually have to scoop things up. Now this third game's a little bit different. This is an example of how tempo can aid us in the aggro matchups, as we're able to pop back a couple of Clerics of Life Bond to our opponent's hand, and then by the time they're able to get a Luminarch Aspirant down, we have just gotten way too far ahead. So that's how we did Waking the Trolls, and there are still other ways to build the deck. I've seen Naya with like Felidar Retreat, right, because Waking the Trolls gets you a land from your opponent's graveyard. I've seen all kinds of ways to build this deck, but so far this is the one that I've had the most experience with and the best experience with too. So try this thing out if you can. Yeah, there's some more expensive cards in here. Yeah, there are some mythic and rare wild cards, but if you get a chance to play this, I do think this is the best way to play Waking right now, and Waking has the chance to be a good card. Again, we're in kind of a meta shift right now where, especially on the ladder, we see a lot of shift back and forth, and especially, let me say especially again, especially in best of one, we're seeing a lot of shift back and forth from these aggro decks, these mono red and mono white decks, to these Yorion decks that play like Shadows, Verdict, and whatnot. And when those decks are popular, this deck is actually very, very good. So again, give it a chance. There are some matchups this deck just basically auto wins. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Ziggy did. He's still down here. He's sunken in at this point. Were you asleep already, buddy? Oh, poor boy. But anyway, if you enjoyed the content, do me a favor, hit the thumbs up button. And if you haven't done it yet, it would mean a lot to me if you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the notifications. Even if you're not the kind of person that subs to YouTube channels, Lord knows I don't do it enough, this one time would mean a whole lot to me. You want to see more of this content. This is good content. Aside from that, if you want to support the channel, there are a couple of ways of doing it. We have a Patreon, and if you donate $1 a month to the Patreon, you can vote on what decks we do. And we're going to be doing a lot more deck techs here soon. This is the second deck tech in a week. It's like the old days. And we're going to try to get back to the old days too. I want to do a whole video about this, but I feel like I have been doing too many, gameplay videos. I've been waiting too long in between deck techs, and I want to get back to the time when we were doing like 3 deck techs a week. You guys remember the glory days? Let's do that again. So if you want to be a part of that and vote on those decks and just support the fact that we're going to go back to what the channel was meant to be in the first place, I would really appreciate the support. Link in the description to Patreon, $1 a month to vote on stuff. If you want to watch me play Magic or perhaps even other games, possibly, sometimes, mostly Magic. Only Magic so far, but there are other games I want to play. But if you want to watch me play some Magic the Gathering, go to twitch.tv/spmtgdev or hit the link in the description. And while you're down there in the description, there's going to be links to other content. So if you enjoyed this one so much, why not snack on another one? Do it. But anyway, I think I'm actually nailing the self-promotion today. Until I say something. But anyway, I'm usually really, really bad at it. So I'm very self-conscious about it. But anyway, I hope you did enjoy the content, y'all. And if you did, let me know how you liked it down there in the comment section, especially if you've been able to get some games in with this thing. Let me know how you felt about it. And I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.